When the first game in a new franchise is a hit, it's no surprise that a sequel is quickly put into production. And after the massive success of the first Motorstorm, Evolution Studios quickly got the green light to start working on the next game. In less than 2 years after racing through the muddy tracks of Monument Valley, it was time to explore a tropical island. But with such a short gap between the two games, it's fair to wonder if Pacific Rift is just a glorified expansion or perhaps a bold sequel. When you have a successful first game and an established audience, it's not uncommon for a less risky developer to just focus on doing the bare minimum. However, a bolder developer could try to expand on everything that worked in the first game, fixed what didn't, and still bring some new features to the table. But with only 22 months between the first and second game, many might think that much of the content would be reused, but Evolution Studios had something different in mind. As the development team stated, for the second game, they wanted a much wider variety. And looking back, the first Motorstorm, released in 2006, when the PS3's complex architecture was far from being mastered, could feel like an incomplete product at times, especially when you remember it only had one type of event and just 8 tracks. The idea then was to preserve the game's core identity, with aggressive driving, spectacular crashes, multiple routes, and plenty of boost, but to expand on that initial concept, now that the team was more familiar with the PS3's architecture. So with that in mind, let's find out which category Motorstorm Pacific Rift falls into, a glorified expansion or perhaps a really great sequel. And right from the moment you start the game, it's clear that the scope has been massively expanded. Unlike the much more contained and at times repetitive muddy canyons of Monument Valley, the second game is set on a tropical island, but the changes go far beyond the new scenery. When you start the campaign, the festival, you quickly realize the game has 4 main divisions: Earth, Air, Fire, and Water. And this isn't just some cute naming convention to differentiate the races. These themes completely transform each track's environment. The Earth zones feel like races through dense forests, where you have to watch out for trees and heavy vegetation that obstruct your view. The Air tracks feature massive inclines, huge jumps, and cliffs where you can easily slide or fall off, forcing you to carefully plan your route based on your vehicle. The Fire zones bring hot, suffocating races around volcanoes surrounded by lava. And finally, Water. But no, you won't be using jet skis here. Instead, you'll have to overcome waterfalls, deep pools of water, and even small rivers, which can be a real obstacle for lighter vehicles. These elements matter because Pacific Rift introduces a change that also affects how the boost mechanic works. But don't be mistaken, the new features don't stop there. Another very welcome change is that the races are shorter. One of my complaints in the video about the first Motorstorm was that the game could get tedious and frustrating when you had to compete in a race for over 6 minutes, only to fall short and have to try it all over again, especially towards the end of the campaign. In Pacific Rift, at least until the final stretch of the festival, races are cut down from 3 laps to 2. Instead of 5 or 6 minutes, you now need between 2 and 4 minutes to finish most events. It might not sound like a huge difference, but it's an incredibly positive change. And just like in the first game, using boost is still a central part of the Motorstorm experience. Once again, it's infinite and you should try to use it as much as possible. However, unlike the first game where your meter always cooled down and heated up at the same rate, that's not quite how things work here. Remember those 4 elements that divide the races? This is where they really start to make sense. On the tropical island of Pacific Rift, your boost meter will heat up or cool down faster or slower depending on the environment. If you're racing around a volcano near lava and fire, your boost will heat up much faster, and you have to be way more calculated with its use. And every splash, pool of water, or jump you come across will be crucial for helping cool down your engine. There are even sprinklers scattered throughout the tracks, especially in the fire zones, to help give your boost a quick cooldown. And this introduces a new layer of strategy. Now, you don't just have to plan your route based on your vehicle type. You also have to keep an eye out for spots where you can cool down your engine. You even have to consider which races allow you to be a bit more heavy-handed with the boost and which ones require you to hold back. The visual variety that comes with these 4 elements is also a welcome change. We get a much greater variety of colors, vistas, and even track layouts. It's not a complete shock if you've played the first Motorstorm, but it's different enough not only to be admired, but also to force you to adapt to the new challenges. And despite the noticeable visual leap, I noticed fewer frame drops and slowdowns than in the previous game. But given the sheer amount of stuff on screen, be it plants, smoke from the volcanoes, or even dust kicked up by the cars in front of you, visibility does suffer a bit with the native 720p resolution, which can even be dynamically lowered at times to keep the frame rate stable. This isn't surprising for games of that era, but today, now that we're used to higher resolutions or at least upscaling technologies, it can be a little tough to see everything that's happening when the chaos takes over. And you can be sure the campaign will have plenty of moments like that. Once again, we have a career mode that revolves around the festival, so the structure is familiar if you played the first game. You accumulate points and unlock new vehicles based on your finishing position in each event. Finishing first gets you 100 points, second gets you 75, and a bronze medal nets you 50 points. The tracks are divided into the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and in another much needed change that serves as a prime example of what a good sequel should do, there are now new event types. On top of that, you can see right away that loading times have improved, not just for loading the races, but especially when choosing your vehicle. Unlike the slow animations of the previous game, the menus here are simpler and faster, a very useful trade-off. Unlike the first Motorstorm, where all events were traditional races, there's a bit of variety here. Besides the standard races, there are eliminator events, where the last place racer is eliminated at set time intervals. This forces you to at least stay out of last place to survive a little longer. But it also helps to have a bit of luck on your side, since even if you're not in last, there's always the chance of crashing with 1 second left on the clock and getting eliminated when you respawn. In addition to that, we have speed events, which are basically just checkpoint races. While it's a good addition, they end up being more frustrating than they should be. Not just because of the lack of a map, but mainly because the gates appear very close to each other, which often doesn't give you enough time to prepare, and using boost is always a risk. Proportionately, this was, without a doubt, the event type that forced me to restart the most. And even in traditional races, Pacific Rift adds an extra twist to certain events. In some races, you have an extra challenge. Besides trying to win, if you can finish the race under a predetermined time limit, you unlock another event. This rewards aggressive driving, as using as much boost as possible and risking that turn without touching the brakes can shave vital seconds off your final time. Then you have races with a wreck limit, where aggression suddenly becomes less appealing, forcing you to be more careful. And of course, there are still the traditional races, without the time or wreck challenges. The difficulty of the events progresses gradually, and in the final stretch of the festival, especially from levels 6 to 8, the races start to get much tougher, with a combination of an extra lap, going from 2 to 3, and increasingly aggressive rubber banding. This artificial difficult spike makes the races feel much more dependent on luck than on skill or learning the ideal shortcuts and racing lines. There were several times where I thought I was having a great race, with no crashes and using the ideal routes, only to look at my position and see that I was in 7th or 8th place. And this ultimately leaves a bitter taste by the end of the game, which is not what you want from an arcade racer. In these tougher races, I didn't get that winner's rush when I finally got a gold or silver medal. Instead, it was more of a feeling of relief and an immediate wish to play something else, as I didn't want to go through it again. The amount of grind and rubber banding surprised me for an arcade game, especially in races where you have to use a lighter vehicle, like a bike or an ATV, against heavier vehicles and even monster trucks. So get ready to play the same events over and over again. But don't think the new additions are over, because we also have changes to the vehicle lineup. In addition to all the classes from the previous game, bikes, ATVs, rally cars, buggies, racing trucks, mud pluggers, and big rigs, we now have a brand new class, the monster trucks. With their gigantic wheels, they're ready to crush anything in their path, but they struggle with big jumps and are easy to roll over if you make a sharp turn. Once again, the core logic of staying away from bigger vehicles when you're in something smaller and lighter still holds true. And for the first time in a series, you can even customize your driver. Not with complete freedom though, but you can choose from different available models and unlock more throughout the campaign. You also unlock new vehicle models and different paint jobs, which helps keep the variety fresh. But of course, the most important thing is to see how this all comes together on the track. Unlike the first Motorstorm, which only had 8 circuits, Pacific Rift doubles that number. And more than that, the variety and complexity of the tracks have also increased considerably. In Monument Valley, the circuits could feel like extensions of each other, leading to a certain sense of repetitiveness. The variety here is much greater, and the design of the different tracks is excellent. You can go straight from a race in a dense jungle to another filled with heat waves as you try to escape the lava, and then go to an event full of jumps and places to slide out. And the fact that the races are shorter, combined with much more visual variety and different event types, makes the beginning of the game far more enjoyable. You don't get that feeling that after just 2 hours of playing you've already seen everything the game has to offer. But due to the factors I mentioned earlier, I would say that Pacific Rift manages to be more difficult than the first game. The handling model is also a bit different, and the cars tend to slide more, and the tracks are more complex, much more complex. In certain races, it's easy to get stuck on the geometry. You'll be crashing into trees, bridges, rocks, or simply falling into lava. On top of that, with so many details on the screen, the resolution can get in the way, especially when you have cars in front of you. With all the dust they kick up, it gets even harder to see the track, and the lack of a map and checkpoint events is a nightmare. Not to mention the rubber banding ramps up considerably depending on your level in the campaign. And once again, your choice of vehicle is restricted by the event itself, which works as a way to dictate the difficulty, often preventing you from picking the best vehicle class for that specific race. Sometimes it goes even further, forcing you to use a lighter vehicle like a bike or an ATV against much larger ones like trucks or big rigs, where you can be easily crushed with the slightest contact. Still, this isn't a frustrating game, or at least not as frustrating. The track variety in shorter races means that switching or restarting an event doesn't feel as punishing as it did in the first Motorstorm or in other games from that era. But I won't deny that in the final stretch of the campaign, having to restart the same race dozens of times became a real drag. Thankfully, there are also some great things to talk about outside of the festival. In addition to free play, Pacific Rift finally brings a split screen option, and this time for up to 4 players. This is an excellent feature and something that I really missed in the first game. And this actually helps Pacific Rift age better, since regardless of the servers, you can still get some friends together and race the old-fashioned way. The official servers were shut down in 2012, but once again, the great folks at PS1 and PS Rewired have found a way to bring back alternative servers. So if you want to relive the good old days or even experience Pacific Rift's online multiplayer for the first time, I'll leave the links in the video description. Another piece of good news comes from the emulation side of things. Of the 3 main Motorstorm games, Pacific Rift is the most compatible with RPCS3. Of course, when you're talking about emulation, especially for a console as complex as the PS3, there will always be a visual glitch here and there and maybe some performance issues. But Pacific Rift runs surprisingly well. This is a great way to experience the game and once again get a glimpse of what a remaster could look like, since you can increase the resolution and even run the game at 60 FPS if your PC can handle it. With all this praise, it's no surprise that Pacific Rift had an excellent reception and truly solidified the Motorstorm franchise. The first game hadn't just been a fluke or an accident. The sequel proved that Sony and Evolution Studios had found a series with massive potential. Even though it was released in a competitive window, going up against names like Little Big Planet, Dead Space, and Far Cry 2, Pacific Rift had already sold more than 1 million copies worldwide by the end of 2008. And in the years that followed, the franchise would stay quite active. In 2009, the spin-off Motorstorm Arctic Edge, developed by Big Studios, was released. And in 2011, it was time for the next major installment, Motorstorm Apocalypse, which has a rather curious story of its own, with real-life events and tragedies disrupting its launch, but that's a story for another video. Motorstorm Pacific Rift is almost everything I could have hoped for in a sequel to the first game, especially considering the short amount of time between the 2 releases. It improves and expands on the first game in practically every direction. It has double the tracks, much more environmental variety, a revamped boost mechanic, a new vehicle class, and a more challenging festival, plus split screen mode for up to 4 players. And for me, it's a great example of a bold sequel. In today's landscape, where sequels often seek to make only the slightest iterations on a working formula, Pacific Rift is proof that yes, even with a tight schedule, it's possible to try something new. And switching genres completely, this is why I take my hat off to id Software and the new Doom trilogy. After all the success and praise for Doom 2016, instead of just making a part 2, they innovated with Eternal, and then they changed things up again with the Dark Ages. But getting back to Motorstorm, this was probably the peak of the series. A sequel that fixed many of the flaws, added game modes, and expanded on what worked in the original. This was definitive proof that Sony had perhaps found its own mud-soaked, burnout-infused Mario Kart. Or at least that's what it seemed like in 2008. But the next entry, Motorstorm Apocalypse, would be affected by real-life events that brought unexpected consequences. But that's a topic for another video. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.